I'd like to bounce off my book, Another Asia, in order to reflect on the politics of inter-Asian cultural exchange within the context of events like the Art Summit. Now, under the sign of Asia, what exactly are we invoking? Some kind of cosmopolitan dialogue extending the global circuit of art events elsewhere, or a more regionally inflected understanding of art practices in Asia, with Bangladesh serving as a hub? Is Asia a mere pretext or stimulus to think global? Or does it have its own, what I would call, catalytic autonomy? How can we trouble the idea of Asia instead of taking it for granted? Working in Singapore in the 1990s on an intercultural theater project, it became very clear to me for the first time that Asia centricity could be the other side of the same coin as Eurocentricity. And in many ways, it could be more insidious. With Eurocentricity, I would say there can be few illusions, given its richly documented history with the narratives of colonialism, imperialism, enlightenment, modernity, development, and so on. Asia-centricity, I would say, is more deceptive, insofar as it functions with illusions of family resemblances, which may not in actuality exist. So let's keep in mind that there are more disparities in Asia at economic and political levels than almost anywhere else in the world. We have the richest and the poorest countries in this part of the world. And I would not underestimate our border disputes and inequitable sharing of resources. In Singapore of the 1990s, it became clear to me that Asia is not just a geographical or cultural category, as I had imagined. It is a state-determined political discourse. Inevitably, in Lee Kuan Yew's government, this discourse was associated with so-called Asian values: Confucian, paternalistic, authoritarian, conservative, not particularly conducive to the transgressions and subversions of art practice, which have been notoriously subjected to arbitrary sentences. Charismatic Japanese fin de siècle artist, art historian and curator, probably one of the foremost and earliest of global art curators from Asia. He'd be perfectly at home in the world of biennales. Okakura visited my home city of Calcutta in 1902, not to meet Tagore, who was relatively unknown at that time. Rather, he came to meet Swami Vivekananda, arguably the most illustrious godman of the times, whose global credentials as a proselytizer of Neo-Advaita Hinduism had already been confirmed at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. Vivekananda died in Calcutta in July 1902, bringing Okakura in close contact with another foreigner who had made India her home, the Irish-born Sister Nivedita, Vivekananda's ardent disciple, who was probably more of a Hindu nationalist than what Vivekananda is unfortunately made out to be in sectarian circles in India today. In 1902, Nivedita edited Okakura's The Ideals of the East. This is probably the first Pan-Asian tract written in English in Calcutta, which is perhaps best known for its magisterial opening sentence, "Asia is one." As my book and many other writings demonstrate, this one is ridden with hierarchies and assumptions of cultural, racial superiority, with Japan, or more precisely Japanese art, setting the standards for all other forms of artistic expression in Asia, which invariably fall short. Inevitably, there was a violent fallout between Nivedita and Okakura on an issue that I do believe continues to be pertinent in inter-Asian cultural production today: the ownership of Asia. Who owns Asia? Whose cultural property is under investigation? How does culture get marked by the specific attributes and prerogatives of the nation, even as we appear to be living in a post-national state? I think that's wishful thinking. nationalism, as we know, is seethingly alive in all kinds of nasty and aggressive ways everywhere in the world. So underlying these questions, there is a murky subtext relating to the dubious negotiations of the art market. Negotiations in which Okakura, unfortunately, was entirely complicit, as he played the role of the middleman in transacting art treasures from China at a dirt cheap price for his employers at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I imagine those treasures will remain there for as long as they exist. So, my question would be, what can we learn from this historical scenario in order to reflect on the ostensibly global cosmopolitan phenomena of biennales and art summits today? If there is any one motive that I'd like to emphasize in this context, it would be Tagore's universal humanism, which should not be rashly conflated with cosmopolitanism, a humanism which was directly positioned against his total rejection of the idea of nationalism. No writer in the world, to my mind, has critiqued nationalism more unsparingly than Tagore. In his 1916 lecture tour in Japan in the midst of the First World War, when he was greeted like a rock star, having won the Nobel Prize in 1913, he systematically countered what he called the idolatry of nation worship by reminding his Japanese audiences that nationalism needs to be rejected on account of its soul-denying mechanization, its submission to modernization without modernity, its cult of surveillance through the protection of state secrets, those are his words, and its racism in the way it inferiorized poorer neighboring countries. It is no surprise, my friends, that Tagore was persona non grata by the end of the tour. He was cut dead. He was ostracized by his Japanese critics, facing much the same isolation that he was to experience on his 1924 trip to China, where the Communist Youth League compelled him to cut his lecture tour short with the invective, "Go back, slave, from a lost country." So, how may one retrieve such moments in our shared history of Asia, which is as much a history of commonalities as it is a history of what could be described as intimate antagonisms? Are we ready as artists, thinkers, curators, to confront these moments in the past in a dialogic way, or is it better just to forget about them? More critically, how do we negotiate the paradox of Tagore's anti-nationalism with the fact that he is indeed, in this part of the world, our most beloved national poet, and indeed the composer of our national anthems, both in India and Bangladesh? In my reading, it's a mistake to soften Tagore's anti-nationalism by invoking a good nationalism as opposed to a bad nationalism, or by turning to more contemporary categories like a civic nationalism as opposed to an ethnic nationalism. Nor should we try and see that ultimate camouflage of patriotism as some kind of antidote to nationalism. I would suggest that we need to contend with the paradox itself of Tagore's national anti-nationalism by forging new imaginaries of the national in opposition to nationalism. This is not an easy task, given the fact that the national is only too easily subsumed in nationalism. But that's why we need to invent new epistemologies of the national. In my view, it's not scholars, social scientists, academics who can do this. They're totally trapped, believe me. I think it's artists who are best equipped to invent these new epistemologies. This became very clear to me while I was working on an intercultural theatre project in Adelaide, Australia, where I had the privilege to interact with 15 to 20 artists from many different parts of the world. And significantly, I noticed that despite their hyphenated identities, Chinese Australian, Polish Australian, Iranian Australian, Japanese Australian, etc., each of these artists were very cool, very postmodern, very global, but each of these artists wanted to hold on to the component of Australian in their identities, but each wanted to imagine what it means to be Australian in highly personalized ways. So instead of abdicating the national, which is the fashionable thing to do, thereby leaving the space open for nationalists to define the national for us, these artists were united in their rejection of the official nationalism represented by Prime Minister John Howard. By this time, he had made himself even more infamous by declaring his open hostility towards both people and refugees seeking asylum in Australia. Quote, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come," a diktat that is disturbingly similar to the xenophobia faced by Rohingya Muslims today, who are indeed perilously alive within the borders of Bangladesh, even as we participate in an art summit in the capital. Something to think about. Tellingly, John Howard received the sharpest rejoinder not from his political opposition, but from an elder in the Aboriginal community, a woman called Wajularbina from the Gungalida community, who spoke her mind in plain terms. Quote, "This is not John Howard's country. It has been stolen. We, the Aboriginal people, have always had the same kinship system for all human beings in a spiritual way. Our religion and cultural beliefs teach us that everyone is a part of us and we should care about them. It's a duty." Note, duty, not right, not obligation, duty. I think these words resonate with the philosophy of Tagore, testifying to the need for generosity, hospitality, and an openness to strangers, principles which I do believe that biennales and art summits need to keep in mind, thereby countering the narrow and vicious agendas of nationalism with new imaginaries of the national, at once culturally and ecologically grounded and open to new ways of being.
Thank you, Dhaka Art Summit, for inviting me here, and thank you all for being here this morning. So today I'm going to be speaking very briefly about two projects that I have worked on in the last 6 years that have both been centered in Southeast Asia. The Jogja Biennale in Yogyakarta that I co-curated in 2011 with Alya Swastika, and the Singapore Biennale where I was one of the 9 associate curators that opened in 2016. Before I begin to describe these two exhibitions, I must add that I had never had the chance to curate an exhibition in Southeast Asia before. My first opportunity to think about art histories, and exhibition making in Asia began when I was invited to co-curate the Jogja Biennale in 2011. A group of artists in Jogja had come together to initiate what was called the Biennale Equator series, a series of exhibitions every 2 years that would, each time it was held, bring Indonesia in contact with one other country that was located near the equator. The first in the series was the combination of Indonesia and India, and the idea was to explore the histories of two non-Western countries through their own historical and developmental experience in the form of a cultural dialogue. I remember how my first research visit to Jogja in May of 2011 came as a great surprise to me. My first few days there brought to mind the comment that Rabindranath Tagore, the eminent writer from India from the 19th century, was said to have said when he first arrived at the port of Jakarta in 1927. He said, "I see India everywhere, but I do not recognize it." This was so true. We shared a common geography, a common kind of history. Both countries were colonies of the West. Indonesia got its independence from the Dutch in 1949, and India from the British in 1947. The aim of both the leaders of the newly independent countries was to retain the heterogeneous character of their countries and shake off the yoke of colonialism. The Bandung Conference in 1955, the earlier one, first one. The Bandung Conference in 1955, initiated by 3 idealistic leaders, Indonesia's Sukarno, India's Nehru, and China's Zhou Enlai, has been described as a watershed event in anti-colonial politics and modern international relations. But we have come a long way from there. India pursued the path of secular democracy, while Indonesia is a Muslim country where democracy has intermittently made cameo appearances. Indonesia had its first democratically elected government in 1999. Keeping the close connections that existed between India and Indonesia several millennia ago through trade, religion, political solidarities, we tried to come up with a visual framework that would explore and unpack the artistic practices in two particular regions that had never been brought in such close contact before. We didn't set out to compare and contrast similar generations of artists, shared artistic styles, movements, or genres. Instead, we chose a common theme through which similarities and differences in the choice of mediums, styles, and approaches would become apparent. The theme of the Biennale was religiosity, spirituality, and belief. Can I have the light, please? Yeah. The title we chose for the Biennale was called Shadow Lines, from Amitav Ghosh's book of the same name. And the lines in the exhibition referred to the Equator, borders constructed in Southeast Asia by colonial rulers, and it also referred to the development of nation states, excessive populist nationalism, and the violence that can result therein. Metaphorically, it also referred to the very thin line that exists between spirituality and religiosity, between personal belief and a collective mania that crosses all territorial borders. The image we chose, and which you see here, as the representative image for the Biennale, was taken from Amar Kanwar's trilogy, A Season Outside, To Remember, and Night of Prophecy. And the line that you see here is the Wagah border that separates India from Pakistan. We chose 40 artists from both countries, of who 15 were from India, and interestingly, most of the Indian artists were older than their Indonesian contemporaries, counterparts. We included works of different genres, mediums, and styles. We showed different kinds of films with diverse content by artists such as Amar Kanwar, Krishnamurti, Tramaroma. And we also had large-scale sculptural installations by artists like Atul Dodia from India, Aramiani from Indonesia, whose works referenced both literature and language and spoke in very subtle ways of binaries such as language versus pictures and objects, the figurative versus narrative, traditional versus conceptual, violence versus non-violence and culture. And we also commissioned a very large site-specific work by Valsan Kolleri. The Biennale opened to a grand start. We had almost 1,500 people at the opening, and there was a feeling of great excitement and energy in the air. We were able to pull off something close to the impossible. We put this Biennale together in 6 months, and in a nail-biting photo finish, the works from India arrived the night before the opening, and we were up the whole night installing the works. The whole experience of working on the Jogja Biennale was very important for me. India has still recently never been a part of the Asian conversations, and it's only in recent times that we are becoming a part of it. It gave me the chance to discover a world of art and artists I had never known before, but I just wish, however, that we had had a bit more time for our research, because if we look back, there did exist cultural roots, networks, connections, chance encounters between artists from South and Southeast Asia, from which new narratives and histories could have emerged. Unlike the Jogja Biennale, which looks specifically at 2 particular regions, the Singapore Biennale that I was invited to work on a year and a half ago, an atlas of mirrors that I curated with 8 other associate curators, 5 from the Singapore Art Museum, and 4 invited curators from China, Malaysia, India, and Singapore, looked at the vast regions called Southeast and South Asia. It was the first time that the Singapore Biennale had invited curators from South Asia, China, and India to be a part of the curatorial team. So to what does an atlas of mirrors refer to? Essentially to the bringing together of a plethora of experiences from several regions in Asia that both situated and reflected each other. it was also an opportunity for each of these countries to hold up a mirror to each other, to both uncover and illuminate the routes they had taken to bring themselves to where they stand today. The Biennale tried to bring together a diverse range of historical experience perspectives from the vantage point of East and South Asia within the context of world history. But what are these regions called Southeast and South Asia? Is it possible at all to visually or sonically represent them? What effect do the borders, walls that come up between nations have on the lives of the people? What are the different ways in which artists can capture this within an exhibitionary framework? So some of the themes the Biennale tried to address were Asia as a continent to be mined. You have Tita Ruby, where she says history repeats itself, first colonization and now globalization. Panapan Yodmani from Thailand, a chronicle of Southeast Asian history in which the past, present, and future are amalgamated. The mural contains stones, broken fragments from temples, and miniatures of Buddhist icons. Paula Pattaya, an artist from Sri Lanka, recrafts the official version of maps to tell a different story. The maps he constructs are like palimpsests, where he overlays, juxtaposes, and morphs portraits of voyages, landscapes, mythical figures, and other maps to reinscribe stories of Sri Lanka's violent past and present, interspersed with his own personal history. What is the human angle of maps and borders? Witness to paradise, and if there is a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this, the Mughal emperor Jahangir's description of Kashmir in the 17th century. Kashmir, once a land of multitudinous beauty, is now a ravaged valley that is beset by death and destruction. Located in the northernmost tip of India and administered by both India and Pakistan since 1957, Kashmir is considered the unfinished business of the end of empire and remains one of the oldest unresolved disputes of the world today. Witness to Paradise is a curatorial project that attempts to capture mediated reflections of a landscape that was once and now is Kashmir through the works of 3 artists and an anthropologist who have been closely connected with the region. This is the work of Praneet Soy. The installation consisted of 44 painted paper mache tiles arranged upon a table, a series of chalk drawings on the wall. Soy's is an oblique reference to the state of Kashmir and the media's perception of it, fed on images and information that obscures more than it reveals. Nilima Sheikh, the paintings refer to the trauma which Kashmir has been undergoing for the last 2 decades. These paintings are a meditation on the nature of destroyed beauty and the necessity of memory. Abir Gupta, the firhan that you see here, which is a garment that is worn by people in Kashmir. The firhan has today transcended local use to represent Kashmir, a widely consumed tourism memento, and is continually appropriated by the political to symbolize both cultural nationalism and protest. We had one other artist, but the slide seems to be missing. And that's all right. And that was actually photographs that curated by Sanjay Kapoor. And his book, in fact, is called Witness, where he talks about photography and photojournalism as a valid contemporary cultural practice. And his project aimed to trigger a conversation around the place of art in Kashmir amidst conflict. So this was a small curatorial project within the larger Biennale. The previous one, please. This is a work by Munim Wasif, I think who's in the audience here, from Bangladesh, where he talks about borders between Bangladesh and India, and sometimes where borders become more important than people. The surreal world that is Asia, Deng Guyan, Noah's Garden, which had mirrors and artificial plants. The consumerist world that is Asia, Subodh Gupta's, globalization, surplus and affluence on the one hand, and dearth and deprivation on the other. And this is Edi Susanto from Indonesia, his work. And he talks about the impossibility of containing Asia. The images in this artwork, the journey of Panji, are taken from reliefs illustrating episodes from the Panji cycle, a collection of stories revolving around the legendary Prince Panji, whose tales of heroism originated in Java, but spread over time to Malaysia, Cambodia, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand. In 1971, it was compiled together as a book by S.O. Robson. Even as the work reminds us of Asia's shared cultural histories, the letters spilling out from the compendium of stories suggest the impossibility of containing Asia and the limits of any attempt to unify its histories. I'll end with a question. I don't know if it's meant to be a question, from Rustom Bharucha's book, Another Asia, where he says, how can one think about Asia today through its conflicting modernities, wars, and spectrum of differences that nonetheless coexist with legacies of kinship and intimacy that are becoming increasingly harder to define in the age of globalization? Thank you.
And Baji also from Myanmar, it is appropriate to begin with a few questions. First, what is there about this not so distant past, but whose configurations are quite distinct from those of today, that might serve to nourish contemplations on the present and the future? These artists we call Southeast Asian did not even necessarily understand themselves as such. Second, why has Shantiniketan been thus far omitted in the narratives of 20th century Southeast Asian art, albeit her role in nurturing some of its most accomplished artists? The third question would be, why now, and why here at the Dhaka Art Summit? I do not seek to answer these questions over the next 10 minutes. They serve to anchor the study in the present, as fluctuant and multifaceted as the present might be, and to navigate reflections at a stage whereby there is as yet no precise data. What shall follow are indices of the potential of sustained inquiry into the artistic and intellectual connections between these two locations, united as well as separated by the Bay of Bengal. Preceded by extensive networks in ancient times, these connections are not new. It is their contexts of production, reception, and interpretation that have altered. Due to the extreme time constraint, I'll be reading excerpts from the original paper prepared for this panel with an emphasis on Sultan Harahap, the earliest and least documented of the 5 artists. The many unknowns obscuring his study is emblematic of the challenges facing scholarship on Shantiniketan and modern Southeast Asian art. Records from Shantiniketan's Nandan Museum indicate that Sultan Harahap arrived by 1922, a year after the Vishwa Bharati University was founded. Lionel cuts signed and dated 1931 in the same collection suggest that he was active in Shantiniketan for at least a decade. In fact, he seemed to have been a prominent figure there. A 2007 report by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India identifies him as the author of a lost panel representing geese at the Pantashala from the second half of the 1920s, alongside Binoda Bihari Mukherjee, who was responsible for other parts of the same building. Of the 5 Southeast Asian artists, he has the largest number of works in the museum's collection, a total of 27 paintings and prints, while Afandi, Indonesia's first modern artist to gain international recognition in the 1950s, has only 1, and none of the other artists any. 3 of his prints have also been reproduced in 4 university publications: the Vishwa Bharati News in 1932, the Vishwa Bharati Quarterly in 1935, the Vishwa Bharati News again in 1939, and Amadar Shantiniketan by Sudhiranjan Das in 1959. The only other Southeast Asian artist whose work is known to have appeared as an illustration in a university publication was Harahap's fellow Indonesian artist, Rusli. All this suggests that Harahap's works were fairly appreciated by his teachers and colleagues. Apart from an accentuated verticality in the composition of his prints, there is nothing exceptional in terms of execution and subject matter that sets them apart from the other works gracing the university publications. It is Harahap's mastery of the brush, as revealed in his studies of ducks and geese, that is outstanding. In the absence of photographic documentation of his mural painting of geese at the Pantashala, his ink paintings on paper of the same after Nandala Bose provide a clue to what it might have resembled. His studies of ducks, which were common in Shantiniketan, demonstrate similar exquisite line work and attentiveness to the bird's character and movement. No record of his name, however, in all the variations known in Shantiniketan has been traced in any known oral, published or unpublished account on Indonesian art. It is not even known when and where he was born and passed away, although his name points to Sumatra as a likely place of origin. Neither do we know when he arrived in Shantiniketan and left. Rusli, the second Indonesian student at the Kalabavan, did not know Harahap, which means that Harahap must have left before his junior arrived in 1932, perhaps between the lino cuts signed 1931 and the summer of 1932. By right, Kalabavan's student records should be able to shed light on these matters, but their whereabouts are currently unknown. Besides, the documentation of students during the early years was probably even less systematic. The assumption has been that Harahap returned to Indonesia after leaving Shantiniketan. But what if he did not? If he did, he would have faced a vastly different intellectual culture, a time of agitation and mounting nationalist sentiments leading up to the formation of Persagi, or Indonesian Painters Association, in 1938. Documentation on Rusli is comparatively abundant in the form of appendages to the historical developments and institutions of modern Indonesian painting. There is, however, no detailed biographical account, much less a critical study of his practice and oeuvre to date. Considering that he returned to Indonesia following Nandala Bose's recommendation, the full extent of Shantiniketan's influence on this artist, who, like Affandi, has often been misconstrued as expressionist, remains to be known. While Rusli's melding of color and line against the void of the unfilled ground is distinct from his Indonesian contemporaries' more conventional, layered use of the oil medium, this technique and style can likewise be discerned in the works of Affandi and Ongso. The prevailing narrative on Affandi is that he was not shaped by Shantiniketan in any way, given that the entire family traveled during the most of their 2 years in India from 1949 to 1951. But the fact that he painted with his fingers only after Shantiniketan merits investigation. After all, every 3 months they returned to Shantiniketan to collect the scholarship money before traveling again. During this time, he interacted with other artists, as evidenced in 2 photographs taken in Shantiniketan showing Ongso, who arrived in July 1951, and Ramkinkar Beg, to whom he was relatively close. He certainly painted in Shantiniketan, examples of which include a study of the Shantiniketan hospital and a life-size painting of a bald singer who regularly passed by their home. As for Phua Haripita, Thailand's first national artist, and Ongso, Myanmar's trailblazer of modern art, albeit spending less than a year in Shantiniketan, both acknowledge its lifelong influence on them. Ongso wrote articles in honor of his Indian gurus, signed off Shantiniketan, and reminisced about his sojourn the next 38 years of his life. Unsurprisingly, studies on Shantiniketan's impact on this Burmese artist is the most advanced of the 5. As is the case of Affandi, it is not always possible to isolate what arose from their own insights prior to Shantiniketan, what became reinforced thanks to Shantiniketan, and what from Shantiniketan inspired them in a hitherto unknown way. Parallels in their works further complicate the networks of influence. The motif of a hand cradling a dead bird, the light motive of the sun, and the use of line as color, for example. One way of rethinking modern Southeast Asian art through Shantiniketan is to understand these 5 artists' dispositions, aspirations, constraints, and contexts in relation to their shared exposure to Shantiniketan's credo and pedagogical framework. The relativization of Western art, for example, meant that what resembles expressionism, surrealism, or abstraction is not necessarily whence derived. Indigenous art, both classical and folk, as well as thought systems at times bordering on the esoteric, offer the same, if not more. Even when the artists actively experimented on styles and methods of the modern Western world, they were not subservient to it. They were autonomous in their selection of visual references. Tagore's insistence on freedom in thought and action, one that transcends imperialism and nationalism alike, no doubt inspired these Southeast Asian artists to see, to experience, and to picture the world in ways other than those dictated by fashion and tradition. These insights are crucial to complicating the genesis of modern art in Southeast Asia in the 20th century, whose narratives have been thus far conditioned by a one-way conduit from Western Europe and North America. Whether here in Dhaka or elsewhere, of interest to us today is the potential of similar attitudes in revitalizing modes of thought, sight, artistic practice, and simply being. Cultural insularity and an internationalism that suppresses difference.
It was initiated in 2010 by me and Gao Shiming, and it was launched at the 8th Shanghai International Biennale. And the name West Heavens, of course, refers to what we today all identify with what is modern. The West for China always conjures the imagination of the modern. But the first imagination of the word West implanted in the Chinese mind is South Asia. It is about Buddhism. And West Heavens is a common term referring to, there's an old reference to South India South Asia by China. The 2010 project consisted of a series of lectures by 7 Indian South Asian scholars, and it was held over a period of 3 months inside the Biennale. Together, there was a separate exhibition curated by Chaitanya Sambrani, which had mostly Indian artists and a few Chinese artists who both traveled to each other's country for extended visits and created works specifically for the audience, at that time for the audience in Shanghai. For this project, a bilingual reader was published for each of the visiting scholars, and each lecture was responded to by 3 to 4 Chinese scholars. The significance of this first project was it marked China's first major exchange of public intellectuals with India since the celebrated tour, or infamous tour, of Rabindranath Tagore in 1924. And in our case, art served as a platform for stimulating the imagination about the South Asian subcontinent. West Heavens is about recovering another Asia in China. This another Asia in China has been so well integrated within the Chinese consciousness that we have lost sight of its modernity. I'm again, of course, referring to the story of Buddhism, but the embedded memory that is significant to remember today is China's first major Western cultural influence came from South India, not Europe. And this Western wave affected China's most radical cultural transformation before modern times. And Buddhism, and this cultural change through Buddhism had hardly any of the drastic detrimental effects of the second Western influence, which incidentally, just a few weeks ago, has identified China as a major strategic adversary. The lesson to be learned is profound cultural exchanges can be peaceful and respectful, and they can be free of religious missionary proselytizing and colonial exploitation. Western modernity is today Asia's, or has been Asia's common fate. It is important to update the contemporary life of Asia's embedded consciousness in order to reveal the true nature of modernity. Through engaging this other Asia, it will be more possible to compare and understand both the gains and losses under the regime of the modern, especially since modernity has always been promoted as a repository of everything that is good for now and for the future. And for South Asia and China, what is most interesting is how these two ancient continuous regions of civilizations arrived at modernity. One came through a long struggle with colonization. The other took the path of revolution. There is much to be learned from such radically different historical fates, and the lessons should be important not just for the two civilizations involved, but also for everyone in the new globalized world today. The West Heavens Project, since 2010, has had many permutations and various projects, and it developed later on into also a small project that the original project director Chen managed to develop on their own in Shanghai. So I'll pass the microphone to her.
I'm very honored to have this chance presenting Dhaka, which is the first South Asian countries that I visited, which is not India. I've been visiting India for 10 times because of the West Heavens Project. And I've personally also learned a lot through the whole experience, which the opportunity which was provided by Johnson and Gao Shiming. So I would like to, because we have been developing projects in the past 6-7 years, so I will focus on one urbanist project that was started from 2011 from Bombay, while we were visiting some urbanists in Bombay. So the first time that we started to work with them was in 2011, and we have been doing exchange called Same Urbanist Bombay Shanghai Urbanist Exchange Workshops for 6 years. So this is also a place in Shanghai, but will not be identified as a place in Shanghai, a symbolically Shanghainese place, because Shanghai has been more or less represented as a cosmopolitan city. We see the high-rises landscapes seen from the Bund to Pudong. But our visit to Bombay and this exchange of refreshing our idea of what a proper modern city is like through these 6 years exchanges had made us to think about if from many urban Indians' imagination, if Shanghai is seen as a future city, like Bombay would like to become Shanghai in the next 10 years or 20 years, then how can we reshape our own expectation and imagination of Shanghai itself by inviting Bombay architecture students and professors and urbanists to Shanghai? So in fact, so in 2013, which was the third year of our exchange, we were introduced to a place in Shanghai called Dinghaiqiao by a professor in Shanghai, which is a former working class neighborhood. And this whole area remind me of some of the earlier textures of Shanghai, which is gradually losing. But we can still find it either in the streets of Dhaka, as I walked yesterday, or in the streets of Delhi and Bombay, but was more or less suppressed. This area has been a textile industry community since 100 years ago. So following the history of the Bombay mills, in fact, many early capitalists moved to Shanghai since late 19th century, early 20th century. And it has been also a very important site during the Cultural Revolution, when one of the most important leaders, worker leaders, Wang Hongwen, who later became, during the Cultural Revolution, the vice president of China. He is also a worker in this area, who also resides in that area. But since 1990s, with the decline of the state enterprises, the whole community has been under decline. And so the story of this community has been more or less also suppressed from the main stories of Shanghai since 1990s. So this is the area, and what we did in the 2013 workshop with the Bombay Exchange. So we invite local artists and designers from Shanghai to work on this community. And yes, so in 2014, I personally curated an exhibition under using this theme of the Stinghaiqiao as the title for the exhibition. For the Power Station of Art, there was the first Emerging Curators prize. So I won the prize, and I make a series of workshops and make it into an exhibition. And I also rent a 3 stories private house in that community, and we use that base for a place where we can host various kind of events, which is outside the French concession part, which is more or less regarded as
curator and not really an important person. But I happen to be working in the Shilpakala Academy for 14 years as the director of fine arts. I was a professional artist. I should give a little background that in Bangladesh there was no modern art practice till 1948, immediately after the partition of India. Some of the teachers from Calcutta came and started an art training center. I was in the 3rd batch. That was in 1955. I graduated in 1955. And I continued as a painter for nearly 22 years. And this Shilpakala Academy was established by the great leader, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, in 1974. And I was requested in 1977 by various sources, my teachers, my friends, to look after the Department of Fine Arts, because it was established but there was no director. And I continuously refused it. I said that I have never done any job and I don't want to. I'm a painter, I'm a professional painter, I want to continue. But finally I agreed, and when I joined, then I thought that what should be done in the Department of Fine Arts. It took me about 3 months to settle the department's sitting arrangements and guiding the members. They were already working. So first I thought that the Bangladesh should be brought into the international arena of fine arts. And luckily, I was invited to Japan because they were also in Fukuoka. They were having an Asian art. They were having after 4 years, every 4 years. And I had an idea also to have an Asian art Biennale. I was very much inspired. This was in 1980. And in 1 year's time, I could manage the first Asian Art Biennale Bangladesh in 1981. There was a little luck favored me because very few people knew about Bangladesh. It was liberated after 9 months war, and it was a devastated country. But only after 10 years, how can a country hold a Biennale exhibition if the paintings are not, their paintings are not up to standard? So I went to Japan with some few publications of Bangladesh artists. And there came some very top artists and architects from Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, So what I used to do, usually, I used to invite these guests to my room to have a drink and discuss. So I showed them some of these books, and they were very interested. So I told them that we are going to have a Biennale next year. So they said, well, we'll participate. So I said, Indonesia and Philippines officially expressed their inability to join. So the Indonesian gentleman, Mr. Mukhtar Apin, the very famous artist, he said, forget about the government. We have an organization, Artists Association, we will send some paintings. We definitely will participate. So did the Malaysia. The Malaysian art critic, art historian, I'm forgetting the name. But then somehow it all came to our favor, and we had 14 countries participated. That was in 1981. And it was a very successful exhibition. And Japan always was interested to support our Asian Art Biennale. They said that you must continue, whatever help is required, we will provide you. You see, at that time, the government didn't have enough fund also. So we had to collect funding from different sources also. The very idea at that time of Asian Art Biennale was to show the Western and American artists and art critics that the Asian art is also to be considered. And we planned that we will have a mobile Asian art exhibition to all the Asian countries. We'll have periodical discussions and seminars. We'll have publications of Asian artists, because the Western countries don't publish Asian artists' books. There are so many very well-known painters from Japan, from China, from Indonesia, from Philippines, from India. So we started like that, and I succeeded holding 5 exhibitions. Mind it, it was about 38 years back that we, practically I thought of it, and I started planning and doing, and it continued. And we still are holding this Asian Art Biennale. The 17th Biennale was held in last December, and the 18th is going to be in September this year. And then came this art summit, Dhaka Art Summit. And it was a thrilling exhibition, you know. It was very close to Asian Art Biennale in the light of the presentation of artworks and exhibitions. But the discussions and seminars were very different. We used to have a seminar also on the first day, on the second day of the opening. We used to have 2-day seminars on each Biennale. One day used to be the country representation, what the participating country's art is, and the history of it. And the second day used to be a topic, particular topic that we used to give. Something like eclecticism in art, like Asian art vis-a-vis Western art, and like that. And the people used to come, the scholars used to come and discuss about it. But I'm really thrilled about this art summit, because this is conceived very differently. And the scholars that all of you have come, my gratitude, my thanks to you all to come here and discuss. It's a great pleasure, and I have learned a lot from these exposures. I'm slightly disappointed, however, that not very many Bangladeshi artists are present here. But anyway, the art summit that has begun today, and the projections that I saw, I learned a lot about China, the way it's grown. I had been to China in 1984 and I had visited a lot of places and art galleries. But it's something very new that has been presented today. And also about India. And all I can say that I have enjoyed and I wish every success of Art Summit, the 4th Art Summit, and the summit here on. Thank you very much. Probably it was too early to remember. But anyway, I personally feel that there should be more interaction among the Asian countries. More scholars should come and travel to different Asian countries and give lectures, and there should be more publications also, general publications about the Asian countries, their works, and something like there was a publication from Hong Kong, Asian art or something like that. You know, strangely, even Hong Kong participated once in Asian Art Biennale, once or twice, before it joined China. They were very hesitant, but they came. So I think it was a wonderful discussion, and thank you very much to include me.
So I go back to the last image that I showed you in my presentation, you know, of the uncontainability of Asia. There's this huge thing, and how do you define what Asia is? And like all of you have said, there are 1 million Asias, I think. And if we can begin to have conversations with a few of them, I think that would be a really fruitful experience for everybody.
So I think we've got a brief amount of time for a few of you to join the conversation. So are there any questions?
Should I go? Well, thank you very much. It's been illuminating and very interesting to be here. I have 1,000 questions, obviously, and no answers. So it's more a general web of questions. Triggered, you know, one in the last comment that you made about the indigenous Aboriginal comment on the President's comment on the property of the country. It raises a question. In having spent a lot of time in Aboriginal communities in Australia when preparing the Sydney Biennale, I mean, the question of indigeneity is a global question, and it also begs, you know, the relationship between land or custodianship and some sort of authority over a land is problematic since we live in the age of so many refugees from everywhere. So to claim that is one solution, but it's a problematic one. The other is this, what you were saying about the last question about Asia. You know, as a European woman from the south of Europe, from Italy, from the Mediterranean, I know that Asia, the word, comes from the Akkadic Azu, which means where the sun rises, which is a Middle Eastern language of the period of Aramaic period. So it's a very Mediterranean and middle, that area term, the Asia itself. And Europe, I think, is in the same situation that you are saying of there is no Europe. I mean, Jimmy Durham has been asking this question for 30 years. You know, Europa is oiros, the ice, before the Europa, coming from the waters. So it's again a Greek, you know, God knows what Indo-European origin oiros comes from. So it doesn't really exist. I mean, and there were countries like Sweden had no colonies. So there's no tradition of colonies. And the question of internal colonization, and so I wonder, you know, about the question of universalism again, what your thoughts are on some forms of universalisms, which I saw, for example, in Louvre, Abu Dhabi now. Let's not